This is Tim Ashe, President of the Vermont State Senate, candidate for Lieutenant Governor, and here with one of my Thursday Ask Me Anythings. And I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about what happened today in the Vermont Senate. Not that something bad happened, but just tell you the latest update as we sort of wrap to a summer break. Then I'm going to respond to some of the questions that have come in over the last few days in anticipation of this. A couple that relate to Vermont's efforts to provide clean water, both natural waters and also drinking water, because I sent out an email talking about my record on clean water and some of the things I envision looking forward, and that elicited some questions. And also around some of the racial justice and law enforcement work that I'm working on in Montpelier, because some questions came in from that, which is understandable in this moment. So first off, just to remind people, typically the legislature runs from the beginning of January till early May, usually, about 18 weeks, and then there's a week in the middle for town meeting break. This year, COVID-19 hit right in the middle. Basically, the week after town meeting break is when we shut the State House down. So it has slowed everything down. And we spent the first 2 months of the coronavirus pandemic only allowing legislation that was directly related to COVID-19. And in the very first days, of course, we knew very little about how this was going to impact the state and wanted our focus to be 100% on our response to the crisis. And with every day that passed, we came to know a little bit more, but it also made our need to respond like cross-disciplinary. Every single agency of government, all sectors of the economy have been affected, so the legislature started to fan out and work on a whole array of policies to help us weather this storm. In the last month or so, we've started to transition while we work on getting our budget in order and starting to appropriate, meaning spend, the federal relief funds we've received. Other committees have started to put out some bills which are important to get done and which we have the time to do. So the first thing I'll say today, we passed through the Senate a budget for the first 3 months of next year. We have no idea really just how accurate the current revenue estimates are that we have for the upcoming budget year. What estimates we have are not good, a shortfall of $330 million, but we're going to get a revision in mid-August. And so what the Speaker and I decided to do about a month and a half ago was that we would do a budget for the first 3 months of the next year, and then once we have those revised numbers, we would do the budget for the rest of the year, since we wouldn't be flying blindly at that point. So the House had passed the budget over to the Senate. That's the way our Constitution works. The House starts a budget, it goes to the Senate. We've made some changes, a couple of which I'll talk to you about in a minute. We think the House is going to be very happy to see some of these changes, and they did great work as well. But what that signals is we're nearing the end of this phase, and we hope that by a week from tomorrow or so, the legislature will be able to take a break and take the entirety of July off and most of August, and then come back and finish up our work. Very unusual. We've never had a situation like this. We also today sent for the second time to the House what we call Justice Reinvestment 2. I'm going to talk about that in a moment in response to one of the questions. This is a very substantial criminal justice reform package, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we passed over to the House a housing bill, which is intended to allow for increased housing in downtowns and villages throughout the state, trying to reduce duplicative permitting processes. So not diminishing permitting expectations, but making sure you don't have to go through 2 reviews for the exact same environmental issue or whatever it is, and hopefully reduce costs. As someone who's done housing development projects and been through Act 250 and through local zoning, it is no one's fault, but we've got a system which sometimes is unnecessarily lengthy, costly, and has steps that don't always provide value. So we've passed a variety of measures which should help lower the cost of putting housing exactly where we want it, which is in environmentally sensitive, environmentally appropriate places. The bill also tries to step up efforts to support people in mobile home parks that might be in floodplains or in vulnerable areas. That's important to me. I used to be the director of the state's mobile home project through community action, and know that many of the parcels of land that mobile home parks were put on back in the day are often near rivers, so they're prone to flooding and things. And we need to make sure that that valuable, affordable housing stock isn't put unnecessarily at risk. All in all, three pretty substantial bills. It was a pretty exhausting process, of course, all being done while staring at a computer screen. So now I'm going to turn to the questions that have come in the last few days. As we say, this is Ask Me Anything, and I try not to weed out the questions, but just take them as they come. And so I've singled out 5 questions which I think cover an array of issues. And I'll start with the racial equity, the 2 primary questions around racial equity, and then in law enforcement, and then turn to some of the water quality questions which came in. So one question was, will you support divesting from police and investing in social services? I think that the term divesting from police is kind of akin to the defunding the police message that is out there. And I'll tell you what we did today in the budget was put in a provision that I wrote that will require our public safety agency to plan for putting in the budget embedded mental health workers at all of our state police barracks. This speaks, I think, to the question about shifting resources to more appropriate kinds of intervention. So instead of necessarily a law enforcement officer being the first to arrive when someone is in mental health crisis, having someone who's a trained mental health professional be the person who interacts with the individual. And this language was modeled after 2 police barracks in Vermont, St. Albans and Westminster, have embedded mental health workers, and it has been an extremely positive experience, which benefits the individual who's making the call or about whom someone's making a 911 call. It benefits the law enforcement officer, and over time should reduce the frequency that a law enforcement officer has to be the one responding to these calls at all, which is, I think, part of the question. The other piece, in terms of investing in social services, I will say that I very much support investing more in our social service network. And about 3.5 years ago, when I became president of the Senate, I traveled throughout the state and met with every what we call designated agency. That's the term for the agencies that address both mental health services in each region of the state, but also substance abuse disorder issues in each corner of the state. And I met with all the frontline staff and asked them what we could do to help them be more successful on the job, and came back to Montpelier after listening to many, many hundreds of those workers, and we were able to start making some inroads in the resources to help strengthen our mental health field. That's only one piece of this puzzle, but I was very, I don't know what the right emotion is, but it was a long overdue pay raise for many of the frontline workers who work one-on-one with individuals. We also provided some support to people who were in mid-level positions, because often if you're working for a mental health agency, you might have a master's degree, but you might still get paid $25,000 less than someone with the exact same credentials and work experience than if you were working at a hospital in the same community. So we helped create more parity there, and we've subsequently made some substantial additional investments in that network because we know how critical it is to address some of the underlying issues in our society. And frankly, investing in anti-poverty strategies or taking anti-poverty actions is also critical to this, and increasing the minimum wage, from my perspective, is one of a very significant way we can help stabilize the lives of many people by putting more money in their pocket for the work they do. So that's some of the strategies we're doing now, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those themes as I turn to the next question. Someone said they'd like to hear my plan to address systematic inequalities in the criminal justice system. And I will first say I would never claim to single-handedly have a plan to fix all of the inequities in the system. I mean, I think that is something that we know how we can dive in and make some targeted interventions to start rooting out injustices and inequities where they are. But it's not like we'll take a handful of actions and then it'll be over. It's really in addition to those interventions, it's also a process. So it's going to take many of us to be thinking about the manner in which we root out these injustices. So in terms of the plan, I'm going to describe a series of strategies which together are going to help. And I'll say a quick word about each one. I could go on at great length, but it's too nice out for you to listen to me pontificate. So the first is the Justice Reinvestment Bill that I described moments ago. Anyone who follows criminal justice issues in Vermont knows that the population in our jails of people of color is disproportionate to their percentage in the general population. And so anything we do to safely reduce the number of people who are incarcerated has the added effect of helping to undo some of that systemic bias which shows up in a disproportionate number of people of color behind bars. This Justice Reinvestment 2 obviously indicates there was a Justice Reinvestment 1, which was about 15 years ago or maybe slightly more. And last year, I asked our Judiciary Committee, I said, I'm sick of hearing people talk about getting people out of for-profit prisons out of state, because right now Vermont has about 250 inmates out of state in a private prison in Mississippi. There are a lot of people who talk about how we shouldn't do that anymore, but don't come up with the actual plan to allow us to drive down safely our inmate population. So I challenged our Judiciary Committee to come up with strategies to lower our inmate population by about 250 people. And I said, by virtue of doing that, you will have solved the issue of needing to use out-of-state prison beds as a byproduct of that. The strategies include making it so that when you are released from prison, any of our jails in Vermont, at any moment are often populated by many people who are not there for the first crime they committed. They committed a crime, they've been released, and then sometimes they find themselves with some technical infraction. They miss a curfew, or they've had a beer and they weren't supposed to have a beer. None of these things are meant to just be ignored or pretend like the rules don't matter. But the question is, should the person be sent back to jail for that? And is it in the public interest to do so? And the short answer is the longer people are behind bars, the more likely they are to repeat offend. And so finding community-based sanctions so that people don't wind up in jail for a month or 2 months over something that's very minor is actually a big deal and can help reduce the number of people who are behind bars. Changing the way we use bail is also a factor in there, and a number of other strategies. So this is going to be one of the sort of signature criminal justice measures in the last 2 decades. And we just sent that over to the House today for the final touches. Second, we have juvenile justice. Same thing. The racial disparities in our justice system really are at all ages. And we have passed some of the nation's leading juvenile justice measures to make sure that when someone makes a first mistake, they don't get thrown in with adult offenders, but rather are treated like the young people who've made a mistake that they are. What this means is we will have more opportunity to immediately intervene when someone's life is taking going down the wrong path, and help get them back in the community and provide them the supports needed so we don't see them back in the criminal justice system. So that's hard work. It's not flashy, but this is the second of 2 years where we're making very significant reforms, and I'm very proud that Vermont has stuck with these because they're not easy policies to implement. And I want to thank the people at the state agencies that have helped with that. I see one question: why is getting Vermonters out of for-profit prisons important? And I guess I don't know the perspective of the person asking the question. If you don't care whether it's for-profit or non-profit, what I hope everyone cares about is, do we really want to spend the money paying for people to be behind bars if they don't need to? So for every person who is out of state at a prison, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, we're paying about $30,000 a year per inmate. So do the math: 250 times 30,000 is a lot of money, and taxpayers are picking up the tab. So that would be whether it's for-profit or non-profit if they're out of state. One of the dilemmas with for-profit prisons is, there's really two. There's a larger fundamental philosophical question about whether people should make money off of people being incarcerated. And we know that all across the country, the very people building the for-profit prisons were also lobbying for very stringent sentencing laws to populate their very prisons so they can make the money. So that's a larger philosophical question, and I won't go there for the moment. The other, though, is if you're in a for-profit prison, generally speaking, you are not being made, you're not having the level of educational offerings, work training offerings, things to help you succeed when you get back into the community the way you would if you were behind bars in Vermont. So being behind bars in Vermont is not like being at the Ritz-Carlton, but knowing that we all have a stake in the person succeeding when they leave the facility, we have a lot of programming to help people get ready for that moment. If someone's in Mississippi at a prison, for-profit, non-profit, basically we get what we pay for, and what we get and what we pay for is basically the minimum sort of prison, classic prison sort of concept that you have in your minds. So that's the short story. But from my point of view, having 250 people be out of our direct control is the primary problem, because eventually they're going to come back to Vermont unless they're serving life sentences, which is very few people. And then we all should worry if they haven't been receiving the kind of supports to successfully reenter. Just today, in the budget that we sent over to the House, we provided more funding for the Director of Racial Equity. This is a position that was created maybe 2 years ago and filled about 1.5 years ago by Susanna Davis. If you've been watching or listening to any discussions about our state's policies in recent weeks, Susanna Davis has been a frequent speaker in different discussions. Very, very talented and good administrator. So she has been really, the position was created to try to root out any administrative practices in state government that would have the effect of creating racial disparities, whether it's employment or discipline and things like that. So we have provided additional funding for Susanna to hire additional staff for the purpose of outreach and education, which is really critical right now. We're getting inundated with questions from employers and organizations wondering how to adjust their policies or the legal questions around the practices they already have. So it's really critical that we provide Susanna some additional support. Last year, we added an additional staff person at the Human Rights Commission for outreach. Way too frequently, there are instances that are very unpleasant and often illegal and intimidating and hate speech and things like that. And communities wonder what to do about it. The first reaction is this is very bad, but people don't quite know how to respond from there. And that's where the Human Rights Commission can be really, really great. They have been trained and tried to work with communities to sort of reckon with what's occurred and then figure out what to do to build from there. And that staff is now on board and doing some really important work. We are about to pass legislation that would prohibit the use of chokeholds and restraints by law enforcement. This is really important, as we've seen the use of these kinds of holds increasingly in the news with terrible outcomes, often death. And this would create a process or a policy that those are prohibited, and that an officer who sees another officer doing it has a duty to intervene. We are on the verge of passing a use of deadly force policy through the Senate. We are going to be working with the House to try to get as far as we can before we break in a week and a half. And then if it doesn't get through the House by then, it'll get taken up in August. But I feel very strongly that while the policy might want further refinement in the months ahead, that we should adopt it now and then let the refinements come later. Because I've seen the rerun play too many times where task forces and work groups, they go off and they have so many people weighing in, and by the end, no one can make a decision, and then nothing happens. So right now, there is no formal state policy on the use of deadly force by law enforcement. I think we should adopt a fair one that's been established elsewhere, and then leave it to people to come back and say how they want to revise it, rather than saying we're going to do nothing until we have it perfect. Body cameras. This is something I've talked about on these on my normal updates in the past. 2 years ago, we put in the budget funds for all state police to have body cameras. They did not purchase them. We learned they wanted to use it to buy high-powered firearms instead, because they thought the storage of the body camera footage would be too expensive. We knocked down that argument because the storage actually turns out to not be very expensive at all. And they're on the verge of finally buying the body cameras, and we are going to pass a policy regarding when they have to be on, when they can be turned off, and work towards additional policies about some of these public records issues about when the public can see the footage on body cameras, which is a rather complicated subject, but we need to make progress. We are also passing language in a new bill that will have real sanctions against any municipality whose police department does not submit racial traffic data. So we've been using this in recent years, traffic data submitted by law enforcement agencies, to determine whether departments are pulling people over disproportionate to their numbers in the community, and then allow us to say to the police force or the sheriff's department or whoever, let's talk about why this is happening and see if there's some things we can do to right the ship. Cutting off law enforcement grants from the state to municipalities for failure to provide it is a very big deal to the budget of these agencies. So we believe this will really put their, really hold them accountable to get it done and get it done well. Today we voted out of one of the Senate committees, so this will be up for debate within the next couple days. Adding civilian members to the Criminal Justice Training Council. This is the council that trains all certified law enforcement in the state. Historically, it's populated by law enforcement sort of usual suspects. Well, not usually, maybe that's not the right phrase, but individuals who work either in the state's attorney's offices, the attorney generals, law enforcement. This will be adding civilians and someone from the state's Department of Mental Health, which we think is a very, very good thing, and will prevent, I don't know if the right term is job shopping by people who've done bad things in a previous law enforcement job. So there have been some cases in the news recently where an officer might have been let go for some unethical behavior, and then without knowing it, another department picks the person up because it wasn't on the personnel file. So we're going to make that disclosure required. So those are a handful of strategies which come together that will help root out some of the systemic inequalities. Admittedly, there's more to do. Describe things largely that can be done in the next couple of weeks that we've already had a lot of progress on. So 3 questions in the few minutes remaining about water quality. First, someone who saw the email I sent out from my campaign said they hadn't heard about the lead in drinking water at schools and childcare work that we did. So just in brief, our Department of Health did a random sample of drinking water out of taps at a number of, I think 17 or 18 schools in Vermont. And most of the schools had at least one tap that was either very close or over the allowed lead standard at the federal level. So a few of us put our heads together and immediately said, you know what, the schools are obligated to provide clean water for kids, as are childcare facilities. And we should go and get a clean slate across the board, test every single drinking water source at every school in Vermont and every child care facility, and then provide some funds to remediate it when the levels exceed what's allowed. We created the lowest allowed standard in America, and to make sure schools didn't feel like we were just handing them a problem without any funds, we paid for all the testing and a large percentage of the fix-it costs that were incurred. Child care facilities already had to do this testing, but we lowered the standard there too and provided support that previously wasn't available to them to do the remediation. My belief is that within about a year, every single parent in the state of Vermont sending their kid to school will know that the water is free from unacceptable levels of lead. This will be the first time that will be able to be said, maybe in Vermont's modern history, and it's a really substantial public health measure. So that's the backstory. PFOAs in drinking water. This also came from my email. Someone asked if any other communities other than Bennington had tested positive. You may know there was a former factory that made Teflon in Bennington, and in addition to the smokestack leaving residue on upwind neighbors, it turned out that the drinking water supply for a number of people in North Bennington was contaminated. And PFOAs are, I won't dazzle you with what PFOA stands for, but it's a chemical word. The alias is forever chemicals because they don't break down. They just don't break down. And so if they get into a system, they stay there, and they can cause cancer. They wreak havoc with cholesterol levels, and they have other health outcomes. It's all bad. And we passed a law requiring every drinking water supply in the state. So whether you're in a city or you're in a village, those public drinking water supplies are now required to be tested for PFOAs. And within about 3 months of testing, we did find 2 communities that had PFOAs in the drinking water. And as I always say, the only thing worse than finding out you have PFOAs or any other contaminant in your drinking water is having them be in your water but not know it. So now that we know that it's there, we can go and either find out how it got there so we can put a stop to that or remediate it by some other means. So it's a scary thing to contemplate because people not only are worried about how they're going to fix the problem, but then they worry how long they've been drinking the water and what its effects might have been. But we absolutely have to know that it's there in order to do something about it. And then the third question was what I saw as the role that land conservation plays in water quality. And it's a good question. It definitely is a more indirect conceptual leap for land conservation to water quality. But I guess I'll answer it by giving an example. Last year, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which is a wonderful organization, came to us at the end of the legislative session and said that they had identified a handful of properties around the state, which they called legacy projects, these significant tracts of land that had been used for public recreation uses like hiking and fishing, and have natural features which are one of a kind or just really significant and important. And we were able to marshal some funds to conserve these 3 large tracts. We're talking multi-hundreds of acres, a couple cases maybe even more than 1,000. And in almost every instance, because they were higher elevation, they were the source of what ultimately became drinking water supply for a number of communities. And the alternative to conserving this land was the risk of active development of it, which would have had the potential of degrading the quality of this sort of pristine water at its source. So, we often think about clean water in terms of natural waters like the lake or any of the Lake Champlain or any of our other lakes. And then we kind of work back from there. We say, okay, the beach is closed because of an outbreak of something because of pollution. Then we say it's the tributary or the stream. And then we keep going back. But every step of the way, we want to be doing the best we can to keep the water clean and starting right at the source. So land conservation definitely has a very critical role. from the highest elevation down to the wetlands and other things that filter out contaminants before it gets into lakes and ponds and rivers. So with that, I'm going to end this Ask Me Anything, and I thank you for the questions. I do see a comment, and this relates to trying to discontinue the use of out-of-state prisons. Someone saying the use of out-of-state prisons is not good for family connections either, which is of course true. The disruption can actually have an effect on the person's readiness to re-enter the community. So sometimes we might say, well, why do people care so much about the rights of an inmate? And while the person clearly did something that's resulting in a very serious sanction, the loss of their liberty, most of the individuals are going to be released at some point. So it's not so straightforward to say, well, they committed a crime, lock them up, throw away the key, and forget about them. We need to do what we can so that they are more successful when they come back and that we're safe when they get out. So with that, I'm going to sign off. I hope you continue to stay safe, and I will see you next time.